Hello and welcome to this month's Mibbes Aye show. Fiona and Marlene here. We're back in the territory of constitution again, but not the Scottish constitution. We've already covered the draft constitution. We've done a little bit on constitutional conventions. We've touched on the idea of a national convention, but we're actually going to be looking at Wales. Quietly working away for the last 2 years, Wales has come up with a constitutional commission. They ended up speaking to 10,000 people in Wales, tasked with a report with recommendations for the Welsh Senedd. This report has 10 recommendations, some of them quite relevant to Scotland as well, some of them very interesting, some of them less directly relevant. But we thought this was such a fabulous piece of work. Could be a bit of a game changer in terms of the constitutional debate in Wales.
That's why this episode's called Where Next for the Welsh Dragon, isn't it?
We've got a fabulous guest joining us to take us through it. She was actually one of the commissioners who took part in this research project, but you'll also know her name very well. It's Leanne Wood, former leader of Plaid Cymru. But first, we thought we would just set the scene a bit with a little clip from the Welsh Parliament. And this is former First Minister Mark Drakeford summing up the debate that took place after the report had been presented.
The status quo is indefensible, no matter how hard the Conservatives attempt to defend it. Look at the constitutional settlement we have. In this Senedd term, the UK government has taken back into its own hands the future of the Welsh tennis court. Now, there's a matter of great public debate, but in their determination to undermine the settlement, the future of the Welsh tennis court is now decided in Whitehall rather than in Wales. The 2017 Act means that we are, in this chamber, responsible for road, for rail, for cycling, but we're explicitly prevented from taking control of the Welsh hovercraft. Now, well, I see marches up and down Wales. But the absurdity of the current settlement simply means that it cannot be defended in the way that Mark Isherwood attempted. I was sorry to hear that old chestnut being trotted out about the one-sided nature of Welsh politics. There is a very easy answer to that, isn't it? And it's just for the Welsh Conservative Party to get better at winning elections. Because the reason why Labour has been in power for the last 25 years, as I say so often, is not because we won it in a raffle, but because we persuaded people in Wales to vote for it. Too often debates on these matters in Wales have been evidence thin. That's why this report is so important, because it assembles that credible and depth of evidence behind the arguments that it puts forward. It says, as he said, that the status quo is unsustainable. There is money in the budget in the next financial year for us to take forward those recommendations at the start of the report that are about strengthening the way in which democracy can operate here in Wales. A deliberative form of democracy in which we engage people in debate, not a dipstick form of democracy in which you ask people on a particular day what they think, but in which we engage them in the complexity of debate. That's what the Commission did. They went out. They didn't simply hand people a piece of paper and say, tell us the answer. They had a discussion with them, and the more the discussion deepened, the more useful and interesting those ideas became. We're not in favour of a piecemeal approach to criminal justice. We're in favour of a journey to the devolution of the criminal justice system, but one which allows the Senedd to absorb those responsibilities in an orderly way, which allows the people who work in that service to see that there is a pathway there, but doesn't mean that we take on everything in one big bang all on the first day. The Constitutional Commission in Wales has done us an enormous service. It has done us a service with the seriousness of the work that it has done, the depth of the engagement that it has had with Welsh citizens, and the fact that it has left us with just 10 recommendations to take into the future. How often my heart has sunk here to see yet another committee report bristling with 70, 80 recommendations, almost all of them guaranteed never to be pursued because of the number of them. Here, there are only 10. That means the Welsh Government can be held to account. And we've made a start on that journey. As I say, there is money set aside for next year. There are practical actions that we will want to take, particularly in those early recommendations. And then we can use the rest of the report as the basis for the next step on a journey that many of us here have been involved in for the last 25 years.
Oh, I really enjoyed that. When you gave me that clip to watch, Fiona, I really enjoyed that. That little dig he had at the Welsh Stories saying, we didn't win these seats in a raffle, you know. We went out there and persuaded people. It was brilliant. You certainly got the sense from the way he talked about that, you know, he values what's come up in the report. And, well, maybe it's a shame that he also decided it was time to retire and leave that particular job. But anyway, we'll see what comes out of our discussions with Leanne. So she was the leader of Plaid Cymru. And if you do recognise her face, it's probably because you saw it on TV, because she used to come up here to speak at the SNP conferences. But she's been a member of the Senedd for, I think she first joined it in 2003, right up until 2021. But then within that period, she led Plaid Cymru, I think, for about 6 years between 2012 and 2018. She's now working as a leader with Community Energy Wales, and we do touch on that in the discussion with her as well. So.
And she's also a podcaster. With the Leanne Wood podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts. We will be talking about the Commission report. Obviously, it's a big document. We'll put the link to it in the notes of the podcast, because I'm sure you're going to want to have a look at it. And there is a really good 2-page executive summary as well.
Good.
Right, so let's bring on our guest. And the first question we had asked her was, where did the report come from?
I think it should provide the sort of food or the nourishment for a much healthier debate about independence for us in Wales going forward, because we haven't really had much to base our debate on. You know, we obviously what's going on in Scotland has been fantastic to watch, especially in the run up to the independence referendum. But we've not really got our own body of literature or academic reports like this one that can, you know, help us have that debate. So it's great that we've got the report, and it's also good that you're willing to give us a platform for it. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Could you maybe just give us a bit of background to it? Where did that idea come from, and, you know, what were its aims? Just so that people know a bit more about that.
Well, it came about as a result of the cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and the Labour government in Wales. There was a cooperation agreement after the 2021 election. There was something like 40 different commitments that the two parties had agreed together, one of which was a commission to look at the future constitutional options in Cymru, Wales. And there had been a commitment in Labour's manifesto to have some sort of body, a commission, to look at everything. But the commitment was strengthened by the cooperation agreement with Plaid Cymru, because it then was going to look at the question of independence. And this was the first time that any sort of official government commission had looked at the question of independence. So we were to take evidence on the range of options, constitutional options for our future that may be available. One being federalism, which was something the Liberal Democrats in particular wanted to explore, and independence was another. And so that was the starting point for the Commission. And I think it was interesting that the chairs who were appointed, it was a co-chaired commission, and it was a gender-balanced co-chairing, and it was Rowan Williams and Laura McAllister, who both come from different political as well as social political traditions in Wales. And Laura has been somebody who's been prepared to push the boundaries on constitutional matters. And Rowan, through his work, I think, in the church and through various sort of charitable organisations, particularly around poverty, had come to the conclusion that the current settlement was not delivering for people in Wales. So the fact that they were together as co-chairs, they brought different things to the table, but they worked very well together. And they both adopted a culture of inclusion and cooperation, which again was something different because previous commissions had been, there had been political sort of dynamics there that weren't necessarily conducive to arriving at good conclusions then, let's put it that way. Yeah. So the culture of the commission was, it was remarkable how there was a real genuine attempt, I think, to speak to as many people throughout Wales as we possibly could. And I think there were over 10,000 people who engaged with the Commission at some point over the course of the 2 years. Really? Yeah, and we could have spoken to more. We could have done so much more in terms of that public engagement, but it was a genuine attempt to have a national conversation, and various different methods were used in order to do that. There were citizens panels, there were online surveys, there were public meetings, there were art projects which enabled people to express themselves through the medium of murals. There were all kinds of different innovative ways of trying to get people talking about what it is they wanted to have as their constitutional future. And of course, people tend not to talk about the Constitution in constitutional terms. It's all about the bread and butter issues, isn't it? How will these powers affect my life? Who is making the decision? How can I influence that decision? So, it enabled us to open up and explore the debate about the kind of Wales we want to live in. And so it was a really interesting experience. It was a humbling experience because you could see people going along a journey, and they, many people started telling us they didn't understand the constitutional settlement, they didn't understand where decisions were taken. But of course, some of these processes provided information and took people along a learning journey. And the positions they started out with in some of these citizens panels ended up being different to the positions that they ended up with. So the more information that people had, the more actually, in many cases, they were going along the journey of independence, which I found very, very interesting.
In 2014, our experience of going through that just exploded people's political awareness and consciousness. But isn't it funny, just the act of talking about it engages people, and then they almost make the decision themselves that, oh, well, maybe that's the best thing after.
Definitely the best way for people to arrive at a different conclusion as well, isn't it? That they arrive at that conclusion themselves after being informed. Because people are making uninformed decisions. People are being asked to make choices without information all the time. And Brexit is a classic example of that, isn't it? Yeah. But when we provide information, and in Wales, one of the other things we found in the report, there isn't any systematic political education in this country. In Scotland, there are programmes in schools and have been for many, many years, as I understand it, that teach people about the basics of where powers lie between Holyrood and Westminster, who the key political figures are, and so on. We have had nothing like that in Wales. Now, there are changes to the curriculum on the way, which will enable more of that kind of discussion. But there really, really is a need for enabling people to understand more about how our politics works, because there is a big disconnect between politicians and people. And part of that is that people feel that they can't have any sort of influence or any kind of say in political decision making. And that's especially the case, I think, when it comes to Westminster political decision making, because that's even further away from them. But even in Wales, we've got a Senedd in Cardiff Bay. I live in the valleys 20 miles north of Cardiff Bay, and people feel disconnected from the Senedd, even though actually we're quite close. Well, imagine how disconnected you feel if you live in the north of the country, which is a 5-hour train journey or car journey away because our transport links are so poor. You know, there are all these kinds of questions. There are wealth divides between communities. There are lots and lots of reasons why people feel disconnected from politics and politicians. And for me, when I came to Scotland on numerous occasions in 2014 and felt the excitement and, well, it was nothing short of a democratic revolution in people's minds, really. You know, there was something there that gave me some hope that we could do something in Wales that was similar, that we could have our own democratic revolution. And maybe one day we will, and maybe it'll be after you in Scotland, maybe it'll be before.
That's right, you never know. But you're right. I mean, thinking back to that campaign, you know, in the run-up to the referendum 2014, I live in Glasgow, and in Glasgow anyway, you know, if you go on a bus, people think it's a bit strange if you don't talk to the complete stranger sitting next to you. But it was even more so in that run-up. You get on the bus and, you know, say hello and chat. And then either I would say or the person would say, so have you decided which way you're going to vote yet? And then there was all these little chats going on buses and taxis and trains about what people thought about it. It was just brilliant. And some of the groups that came out of that there was one in particular called, what's it called, Fiona? Radical Independence Campaign. That's right. And they went into the housing schemes, particularly around the bigger cities. And their one aim, I mean, they obviously wanted people to vote yes, but really what they did was they made sure that people were on the voters' roll, because a lot of people weren't. That was just amazing seeing all that happening. It was great.
It was. I saw it myself, Marlene, and I was blown away. I went to a number of some of the big tower blocks in Glasgow, and I came back a number of times. I had conversations with taxi drivers. I had conversations with waiters and waitresses in cafes. I remember seeing one really, really coffee-stained copy of the big booklet that was produced by the Scottish government outlining all the answers to all the questions. I mean, it was obviously people were looking at it and they were discussing things, and that's why I see it as a democratic revolution, really. I mean, everybody, it seemed to me, was engaged. There was nobody who was neutral. Everybody had a view. Wherever you went, people were talking about it. And the excitement was palpable as well, because people could really envision a very different future to the one we were all heading in and the one we've headed in since, really. And that was, you know, everything seemed possible that summer.
Exactly. We haven't maintained it, unfortunately, but we could come back to why some of the reasons are for that. Just going back for a minute to the Commission report. You were saying it's maybe fallen down the news agenda or people's minds, but what was the idea about where to go with that next? You know, and then also, have you had any responses from Westminster on it?
The silence from Westminster has been deafening. We had hoped, and we continue to hope, I think, all of us who are members of the Commission, that the recommendations will be picked up by the various political parties and included in manifestos. So there are a number of recommendations designed to strengthen democracy, to strengthen relations between Westminster and Cardiff, or not so much strengthen relations, but recognise that Wales exists and provide us with some respect in that intergovernmental relationship. And then there are recommendations around which powers should be devolved immediately in order to ensure that the settlement is fit for purpose, because one of the conclusions we drew as a Commission was that the settlement is not fit for purpose, is not working, and the status quo cannot continue. There are risks for Wales from the status quo continuing in its present form. So there are a number of recommendations around devolving the criminal justice system, around broadcasting, energy. We've looked at other non-devolved matters. And then, of course, there are issues that we didn't have time to look at. So we weren't able to look at in any great detail or depth the position of the Welsh economy vis-à-vis Westminster and the rest of the UK, or big questions like immigration, for example. So there is still a huge amount of work that can continue to be done after the publication of this report. So recommendations implemented in the manifestos, continue to think about what else needs to be devolved in and the other sort of policy areas that we weren't able to cover in the report. Certainly setting up some institutional bodies to take seriously this question of democratic understanding, so that we have some means of enabling people to become more informed about their political settlement circumstances, how they can influence things. One of the recommendations as well is to set up a constitutional conversation that what I would like to see develop into is something along the lines of, I was very inspired by what had happened in Iceland when they crowdsourced their constitution. They put a citizens' body together to learn about and build and create and consult on a national constitution for Iceland. And I just love the idea of citizens being involved in their constitution building in that way. And it may be that we couldn't create a Welsh constitution because we're not an independent country, but we could practice for the time when we become an independent country, and we can then carry out that kind of exercise with citizens building their constitution. And in the meantime, we can carry out an exercise whereby people input into what the constitutional principles could be, or we could have a debate anyway about our constitution.
Sort of like that idea of practicing for it for when we're independent. And there's been a little bit of a move towards that. I think it's a couple of years back now. Mike Russell, he was the SNP president. He got together a group of folk who came from different parts of the Yes movement. So, for example, I was there, not from the podcast, but from point of view of, I'm also in Pensioners for Independence. So he got together a group of Yes movement folk, and we and him and a chap called Elliot Bulmer, who's a constitutional expert. His job is helping, countries develop or even write in the first place their constitution. And the idea was, okay, eventually, of course, we'd need some sort of, maybe even a similar setup as how they did it in Iceland. You set up citizens' assemblies all over the place to create a final Scottish constitution. But in the meantime, you need something in the interim, because if fingers crossed, we have another referendum or some way of showing that we are independent, then from day one of being independent, you need something to put in place. So he took that forward, and my experience of being in it was a lot of it was absolutely, it's about 50 pages, and it's deadly boring in a certain way because it goes into huge detail. But then you get a bit, and it's not like that. It's inspiring. You're talking about what values you want your country to be, to operate under. And, it's sort of that higher level. It was fantastic.
Designing a new country. How exciting is that?
Yeah, exactly.
We're all assuming that the next government in Westminster is going to be Labour, although I'm not sure how different that is going to turn out to be to the current Tories. There doesn't seem to be that much space between them. Do you think that a Labour government there is going to make a difference in how seriously they take the output of your commission? Because, this sort of tin ear that we get from the Tories in Westminster, that applies to anything we try to put to them as well. They just ignore it if they can't actually scupper it. But are you expecting to get a more open reception?
Labour's first reaction to the report was quite negative, really. Their Shadow Secretary of State for Wales kind of dismissed the basic calls around the devolution of the criminal justice system that we said in the report have to happen immediately in order to ensure that our constitutional settlement remains viable. So that didn't bode well. And of course, Labour has always been a coalition of people who stand on different places on the line between British nationalism and independence, to put it that way. So given all of that, I'm not massively hopeful that this is going to be a huge priority area for them. They've had the Gordon Brown report, and it'll be interesting to see how much of that is implemented. But again, I mean, that's very weak, really.
That's kind of sunk without trace in terms of discussion, hasn't it?
Yeah. So nobody's been talking about that really either. I think where the point of hope comes in for me on this is if there are opportunities for Plaid Cymru and the SNP to have some influence in that government. So given there's been some gerrymandering of boundaries, and we all can guess which party that would favour, given which party was in power when the boundaries were changed, then it might be difficult for Labour. I mean, I know polls are predicting an overwhelming majority and an absolute sinking for the Conservatives, but we don't know, do we, under these new boundaries, how that will look. And so there may be opportunities for politicians in Wales and in Scotland, and maybe, Green politicians as well, and maybe Liberal Democrat politicians, to have some sort of influence over these constitutional questions in a future government. I think that's where the point of hope is for me, because I just think if we get a Labour government with a big majority, then they're going to play things so safe and be very similar to the current Conservatives that we're probably not going to notice much difference in either of our countries, and we'll continue to have the old battles that we used to having.
You've got a coalition between Labour and Plaid, which we look on with envy, because Labour in Scotland would not, with a barge pole, go anywhere near SNP. My fear is that Westminster Labour get in, that emboldens Scottish Labour, and if they got a sniff of power, they would be doing everything they could to really dismantle what they can of the devolution settlement, I think. I mean, I watched the debate where it was Mark Drakeford discussing the report. I think it was one of his last speeches, and I loved listening to that spirit of inclusion and cooperation. I don't know if you listened to Holyrood recently. It's just a bun fight. It's just three blokes hurling insults at each other. That's what we've had for the last few weeks. So
these things that don't come about because the blokes like each other, or they want to be friends. It's political necessity that draws parties together, isn't it? And so a Westminster Labour government without a majority, who needs support votes to get over the line, they may not have much room for manoeuvre. Parties often don't have room for manoeuvre when they don't have a majority. So I would like to think that we could have an influence in that situation, but that's all up to the mix of the UK general election, and the biggest deciders in that are not people in your country or in mine.
Yes,
absolutely.
Exactly. I was kind of chuckling when you were mentioning that one of the things that would be good for Wales is to have broadcasting, powers over broadcasting devolved. I think, wow, if we could only get powers over BBC broadcasting devolved up here, because it's so biased. I don't tend to go in for conspiracy theories, but to be honest, some of the coverage, there's never any context. There's editing goes on of announcements and speeches, and if you've listened to all of it, you're going, yeah, but you've missed out the next bit where something different was said. So I kind of think, it'd be wonderful to get the broadcasting devolved, but I think that's such a source of power that Westminster can keep, that they're really not going to give that away. I don't think, certainly not to us, and probably not to Wales either.
No, and I agree with you. It is a strong source of political power. But what we found in the report, as I mentioned earlier on, was that there are large numbers of people who have a very low understanding of the political system and the political settlement. And so the question of public service broadcasting and how our broadcasters keep people informed correctly and make sure people are not subject to reports that misinform, that is something you could start with as a devolved aspect of broadcasting and the press. It may be difficult to devolve the lot initially because of the power that you've just alluded to. But certainly in terms of, if you think about public broadcasting and democratizing the information that people have through public broadcasting, then there's a very strong case, I think, that can be made.
So there's other things that Wales are managing to make more headway on, I think, than we are. And I don't know if it's maybe because you're being smarter about how you do it, perhaps going under the radar a bit more. But things like, what were we hearing about? A publicly owned house building company. What a fantastic idea. And community energy. And you've got slightly more powers under the Wales Act than we have under the Scotland Act about electricity generation. But my goodness, you're using them. And the pilot on universal basic income for care leavers, all those things would be really popular, I think, if we could do them up here. And in fact, a lot of them have been talked about up here, but we don't seem to be making any headway. And yet Wales sounds as if it's making more headway. Is that true? Are you actually making some progress on these things?
Well, I mentioned earlier the cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and the Labour government in Wales. There were 30-odd different policy pledges. And the publicly owned housing company, the community energy developments are all part of the cooperation agreement. So that is what can happen if you bring progressive forces into government, is how I would argue that.
Yeah.
There are some good developments in Wales on that front. But I would argue, some of it is looking at Scotland and seeing what has been achieved there. We don't have powers over the Crown Estate, for example. The Crown Estate is devolved in Scotland, and that's limited, I know, in terms of what that delivers, but it's a bit further forward than we are in terms of being able to have some control over the energy that we produce and then are able to take advantage of. And, there are lots of things that could be done. Again, Westminster is holding back a lot of what we can do, especially in energy. I work in the field of community energy now. We work in Community Energy Wales a lot with Community Energy Scotland, who are a fantastic team of people trying to do their best to increase the energy asset base for Scottish communities. And, in many ways, they're advanced of what we're doing here in Wales. So it depends on which area of policy you look at, what exactly that we're talking about. But there's certainly lots that we can learn from each other, working in not just the field of energy, but right across the board between our two countries. And like you say, there are things that Scotland can learn from Wales, and there's plenty that Wales can learn from Scotland as well.
Yeah. Does Wales have any powers devolved in the area of social security? That was one of the things that shifted over to Scotland after 2014. So most of the big social security ones like universal credit and everything, and pensions, of course, are still in the hands of Westminster. But the Scottish Government does seem to have, I think, used that really creatively. So, for example, there's the Scottish Child Payment. Well, it started off at being £10 a week per child for low-income families, and it's now up to £25 a week. I mean, I've seen that being described, worldwide by experts as being like a complete game changer when it comes to tackling inequalities in a society. And there's certainly inequalities in Scotland, and presumably there are in Wales as well. So has Wales got any of that as possibilities?
A lot fewer responsibilities in that field than you've got in Scotland. We looked at the area of social security and welfare as part of the Commission report, and the general consensus from the evidence that we took was that there were big risks to devolving aspects of social security as you have in Scotland, because the cost of administering that has gone up quite a lot over the years. The point I made in the debate on this within the Commission is, well, is anybody in Scotland saying that those powers should be returned to Westminster then? No, nobody was pushing for that. And I think the policy to give parents of children directly £25 is amazing. I think it's a fantastic policy, and I would love for us to be able to implement a policy like that in Wales, but there is nervousness about the financial cost of providing such provision directly in Wales. It's not a debate that's over at all, because obviously our ability to affect child poverty is severely limited by not having those powers. And where we've been able to have an impact on things like free school meals in schools, this again is part of the cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and Labour. There has been a good outcome to those policies. And there are limited benefits that have been devolved, like council tax benefit. But really, the ability for the Welsh Government to impact poverty in the same way as the Scottish Government has been able to do is hampered by this lack of power over social security and welfare.
Yeah, it is difficult, though. I mean, that in a way, the powers that they're happy enough to devolve are the ones that cost us money. The ones they're keeping hold of more tighter are the ones that would bring money into us to pay for these things. But a current thing that we've just started looking at, we've got a Commonweal as a think tank that does quite a lot of social policy, but from an independent perspective. They've just come up with a paper highlighting just how much foreign investment in Scotland actually results in way, way more flowing out of Scotland. I mean, abroad into tax havens, pension schemes in other countries, you know. So again, it's this not being independent is sort of the blocker to everything you try and do. So it's something that the government are very, very much try and bring money in and bring foreign investment in. But it doesn't come in and we get to keep it. You know, it comes in and somebody else gets rich out of it.
In some ways, this is the question that comes to the crux of our report, really. There were many people giving evidence to us about the poverty levels in Wales and the difficulties that people are facing as a result of poverty, and the difficulties the government faces in terms of tackling those problems, not just from a benefits perspective, but from an economic perspective. It doesn't have the powers to change the economic circumstances, which would enable people to pay more taxes into the pot, which would then enable more public services to be provided, and so on. And it's one of these sort of dilemmas, you know, we don't have the powers, we can't fix the economy. Westminster isn't interested in fixing our economy, but it also isn't interested in giving us the economic powers that we could use to change our future. So we're in this perpetual poverty trap where we can't affect our future economically at all. And that was, you know, it was the big thing that was kind of backdrop in the report, but it was the thing that we couldn't really go into in any depth either, because once you start opening the whole economic basket of questions, that's another 2 or 3 years worth of work. I think, and we just didn't have time to cover everything that we needed to. So we didn't look really in any depth at those wider economic questions. Yeah,
we've got limited power up here to tweak the income tax rates, and when that was given, there was I heard quite a few people saying, of course the Tories or Westminster are doing that because it's a bit of a trap. You know, yes, you can raise income tax, but then you've raised income tax and people won't like that, so then they'll stop voting for it. And at the time I thought, well, the English Tories or even the English Labour may think that that's a trap, but actually I was pretty certain that people up here would go, well, yeah, if I'm earning 100,000 a year, or of course I don't mind paying a bit more if that will help inequalities and start to kind of do something with that. Because that kind of approach is, you know, it's pretty well part and parcel of how we think about what we should do for each other. But that has given the Scottish Government a bit of leeway. I'm sure that's partly, it's not a huge pot of money that it produces, but I'm sure it's partly where they can get the money for that £25 a week. And sometimes I think actually the Scottish Government or SNP themselves are not good enough at blowing their own trumpet, because that's pretty impressive when you can set something like that up.
Definitely, it's very impressive indeed. And because you've got those tax powers and the flexibility within those tax powers to set the bands in the way that they've been set, has enabled you to be much more successful at raising money to be able to then spend on those social programs. I mean, in Wales, we're stuck with 3 bands, and the highest rate of taxpayers are very, very small in number. So there is much more limited room for manoeuvre. That said, though, I mean, taxes could be raised to pay for public services, the Labour government hasn't been as bold to do that as yet. So we'll keep an eye on the situation. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly, as we experience more austerity that is on the way, I think this is something they are probably going to have to look at in the future.
Really so impressed that you've managed to, in coming up with that commission, you've managed to create something that was independent from government, which seems to give it more credibility, I think. And clearly 2 years worth of really extensive reaching out to groups that normally wouldn't have a voice, I think, in quite imaginative ways, but the way you've described it. I kind of wonder if we could do that at this stage, take that 2 years and invest in that. I mean, all our efforts seem to be going into a constitutional convention, which is a talking shop, essentially, ideally with civic society rather than just politicians. But, I suppose it depends how you set it up.
Yeah.
But I'm just really quite attracted to the idea of an actual commission. And if we set it up now, we'd have a report by 2026, which is when the Holyrood elections are.
Could you combine the two and turn a constitutional convention into a report like the one that we've produced?
I think we could. I mean, that setting up that sort of constitutional convention, which would be politicians of any independent sporting party, but also Civic Scotland as well. That was put forward to the SNP conference end of last year. In fact, I think it was Joanna Cherry that proposed it, and it was accepted. So what would trigger it is SNP having a majority of seats in Westminster after this general election. That would trigger that happening. And Fiona and I did a few podcasts when we just talked to grassroots SNP people, but also people who are in other parties. And there was quite a lot of enthusiasm for that. And people began to say things like, you could go off to, Stornoway. You could set up a couple of days of discussion with people there and just ask people what they want, or go up to Orkney or go around the country. So I started to see it in something a bit more akin to that commission in Wales than maybe even what Joanna Cherry meant when she was setting it up, because it was quite specific about negotiating with Westminster. But the sooner it's in place, the better.
If you could encourage whoever is behind setting up this convention after the election, when the SNP get a majority of seats, then direct them to our commission report, because it sets out there how we engaged with people, so you could follow that process and engage with people in the same way. You could engage with more people and have them all inputting into something that you can produce at the end of the process. Otherwise, you're right. I mean, lots of people are able to let off steam, perhaps, but you've got nothing to show for it at the end in terms of a body of evidence. So you might as well incorporate that as part of the work, I would say, because then you've got something useful at the end.
I think that's a really good idea, because the other danger with our approach to the Constitutional Convention, it rests on people being willing to take part. And the Scottish Tories can just stand on the sidelines with their arms folded saying, I have nothing to do with that. Whereas your commission had, if not cross-party support, it certainly seemed to encompass the Tories as well as everybody else. So I think that might be a good way of doing it.
Remember, though, there are Tories and Tories, aren't there? The Tory
there are.
representative that we had on the commission was somebody who was able to work and work together to produce a consensus. Some of the others that we tried to engage weren't so forthcoming. Shall I put it that way? To be diplomatic.
Yeah. With us too, it's not, this general election isn't going to be the make and break about Scotland being independent, but we do need to get at least a majority of seats for the SNP. Well, it'll be the SNP since it's first past the post. No one else is going to get a seat. But really, it's the next Holyrood election that's the crucial one. With our voting system, although we complain about it like mad, but actually, with that voting system, you can count any vote for any independence supporting party as being a vote for independence, and at that point, setting up something of that commission would be a big advantage. I mean, not just at that point, but if we've had 2 years for something to be working away and making suggestions, that would just help. If you've been saying, Leanne, it helps people understand better how things work.
Yeah,
because it's kind of hard when if you're interested in it and you've already found out how things work, it's sometimes easy to forget that the majority of people don't do that.
Exactly.
That could be a big help for us. Yeah.
Well, hopefully some of your listeners will enjoy reading the report as well. It's available online if people want to look at it.
Yep.
We'll put the link in the podcast so they can get it.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
So enjoyed talking to Leanne. She was just so easy. She was very easy to talk to, and obviously she, obviously meant a lot to her, having been through that 2-year process, and especially I think from her side, seeing how people might start off going, "Oh, I don't know what I think about that," but then in the process of thinking it through and having discussions, actually seeing people engage with that and start thinking about, well, their basic question: how well or not does the current constitutional settlement work for Wales? That in itself, irrespective maybe even of the 10 recommendations, maybe even seeing that process at work is a good result, actually, really, really positive result to have them. It's almost something that their commission gave to the Welsh people, wasn't it? Just that interaction.
It was so impressive and absolutely intriguing as well, that the last point that we got onto with her, we've got 2 years now before Holyrood election. We've got 2 years. It took them 2 years to come up with those 10 recommendations. Could we be doing something in that intervening period? And Leanne had suggested, could we link it with the idea of a constitutional convention? So it's not just a talking shop, which really appeals to me, that idea. So if any politicians are listening, why not have a think about that?
We will link to the full report in the notes, and it's well worth reading it. It's a very interesting report. But if you'd like to just know what the 10 recommendations are in full, we'll take you through them now. Recommendation 1, democratic innovation. The Welsh Government should strengthen the capacity for democratic innovation and inclusive community engagement in Wales. This should draw on an expert advisory panel, should be designed in partnership with the Senedd, local government and other partners. New strategies for civic education should be a priority for this work, which should be subject to regular review by the Senedd. Number 2, constitutional principles. Drawing on this expertise, the Welsh Government should lead a project to engage citizens in drafting a statement of constitutional and governance principles for Wales. 3, Senedd reform. We recommend that the planned review of the Senedd reform should be resourced to ensure a robust and evidence-based analysis of the impact of the changes, including from the perspective of the voter and of democratic accountability. Number 4, intergovernmental relations. The Welsh Government should propose to the governments of the UK, Scotland and Northern Ireland that the Westminster Parliament should legislate for intergovernmental mechanisms so as to secure a duty of cooperation and parity of esteem between the governments of the UK. Number 5, the Sewell Convention. The Welsh Government should press the UK Government to present legislation to the Westminster Parliament to specify that the consent of the devolved institutions is required for any change to the devolved powers, except when required for reasons to be agreed between them, such as international obligations, defence, national security, or macroeconomic policy. Number 6, financial management. The UK Government should remove constraints on Welsh Government budget management, except where there are macroeconomic implications. Number 7, broadcasting. The Welsh and UK Government should agree mechanisms for a stronger voice for Wales on broadcasting policy, scrutiny and accountability, and robust work should continue on potential routes to devolution. Number 8, energy. The Welsh and UK Government should establish an expert group to advise urgently on how the devolution settlement and intergovernmental engagement in relation to energy could be reformed to prepare for rapid technical innovation in energy generation and distribution, to ensure that Wales can maximise its contribution to net zero and to the local generation of renewable energy. The remit of the group should include advising on the options for the devolution of the Crown estate, which should become the responsibility of the devolved government of Wales, as it is in Scotland. 9, justice and policing. The UK Government should agree to the legislative and executive devolution of responsibility for justice and policing to the Senedd and Welsh Government on a timescale for achieving the devolution of all parts of the justice system to be agreed by the two governments, starting with policing, probation and youth justice, with necessary funding secured and provision for shared governance where needed for effective operations. And number 10, rail services. The UK government should agree to the full devolution of responsibility for rail services and infrastructure to Wales, with fair funding and shared governance on cross-border services.
Thanks for listening, everybody. And thanks again to our fantastic guest, Leanne Wood.
We've enjoyed doing the show again.
We'll catch you later. Bye now.
Catch you later. Bye.